I feel as if you've purposely sometimes avoided the mainstream. You don't want to end up, working on just some bog standard monthly book. I always felt you seem to veer towards interesting projects. And there's a few guys who've done this, and I think it gives you longevity. You always felt like a guy who was kind of picking his projects carefully, and they were all passion projects and everything. But it's interesting then that you didn't grow up in that Marvel DC thing, the way that most pros did.
Well, that changed when I went to college, and some friends introduced me to Nick Furiation of S.H.I.E.L.D. by Steranko and Neil Adams, an X-Men. And I looked at that art and I said, holy shit, this is not the comics I grew up on. This is visionary stuff. And later I was lucky enough to get to know those guys.
Yeah. Hey folks, Mark here just to tell you about this month's comics from Millerworld. We have Nightclub 2 issue 4 and The Magic Order issue 3. Don't miss it, they're all brilliant. No, I moved away from Scotland. My wife is English and she made me betray my own country and move to England. I'm still annoyed about it.
Are you in England?
I am now. Yeah. It's actually nice. Like, you hear so many bad things about England when you live in Scotland, but it's nice. It's actually been good. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Like, I love your backdrop. Is that an image? Is it like a visual in your room, or is it a visual on your computer?
This is a couple of portable panels where you raise them up.
Ah, right. It's really cool looking. I love that.
Yeah, they had the sunlight's coming right through, so it's distorting all this stuff. Right?
I haven't seen sunlight for about 6 months.
Oh.
Living here, where about? I know it said mountain time. I never understand this stuff. Where is mountain time then?
Mountain time goes from the East Coast to the West. You have Eastern time, Central, Mountain, and Pacific.
See, I'd heard of the other ones, but mountain time I don't know. So, is that nearer LA or what's that?
Is it what?
Is it nearer LA, mountain time?
Not really.
No.
Los Angeles is a two-day drive from here if you drive all day. Where, if you look at a map of Colorado, you'll see we're about 2/3 west of the nation, and the Rocky Mountains run right through Colorado like a spine.
Right. That sounds like a nice place to live, though. It sounds nice. It sounds like the cool part of America.
It's very beautiful here. I moved here from Wisconsin. It wasn't my choice. And I miss Wisconsin every day. I love Wisconsin, which is also very beautiful. However, we moved out here to get away from the winters, and you think, well, you must be out of your mind. But no, we're not, because the Colorado winters are much more mild than they were in Wisconsin.
As we nearly moved to California a couple of years back.
I've never lived in California. Oh, you did?
We almost did, but at the very last minute, COVID happened, and it kind of made us, we had 18 months at home, and made us rethink our plan. But I don't think California would suit me. I think I'm probably better off in the UK.
That was a blessing in disguise for you.
Well, every picture I see seems to be, people out of their faces wandering around the streets and everything. It looks like a hellhole, California now, doesn't it? But do you know, it's funny because normally everybody I've had on is somebody I know in real life, and you and I have never met. We've never actually met before, so it's really nice to meet you because, I've read your work for 40 years.
Thank you, sir.
I discovered you a little later than when you first appeared. You appeared in 74, but I discovered you early 80s with things like Nexus and so on, and Badger. And you always seemed like one of the cool guys, all the comics at that time. To me, there was two types of creator. There was those big burly guys who had beards and glasses. There was those guys, the American pros, and then there was those guys who looked like music journalists. And you looked like one of the music journalist guys. You seemed kind of smart assy and kind of funny and everything. You seem to be a different breed. But were you a comic guy growing up? Did you love comics as a kid and everything? Yeah.
In a way, I didn't really get the bug till I went to college, but what got me on the course was buying a copy of Uncle Scrooge off a spinner rack when I was a child growing up in South Dakota. I read that comic, and I just had an innate understanding that this was superior storytelling. And that's been the case as I look back at all the comics I've read. And I'm sure you know this, that most comics are garbage.
Yeah.
Sturgeon's Law is 10%, 90% of everything is crap. And that's certainly true of comics and movies and television. But Karl Barks never took shortcuts. He was a brilliant storyteller. Mm-hmm. And when you read his stuff, it's not just the art, it's the characterization, the dramatic beats, and the humor that rises organically out of the story, which is a lesson for everyone who wants to do comics.
That's amazing. I mean, you're the first person I've spoken to that Karl Barks. Usually it's Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, all this kind of thing. You know, I love the Karl Barks thing because, I mean, he's the Will Eisner of Disney, isn't he? I mean, he's a master storyteller, isn't he?
He was. For many years, he was not recognized by Disney. You know, they have a thing about that. And mm-hmm. I kept writing them as a child, you know. Before I was 11, I said, who is this guy? How is this? Where can I? And they said, finally, he said, all right, here's his address. And they gave me his address. And he was living up near Seattle. Right. So I wrote him probably by hand.
Yeah.
Mr. Barks, I'm a huge fan of yours. I love your work. Would you draw an Uncle Scrooge for me? And he did.
Oh, amazing. That's great.
And I have it on the wall behind me. And I'll send you a graphic of it when we get off this show.
Cool. And did you keep in touch? I mean, was he somebody you knew as an adult or anything?
No, I wish I had, but I have a good friend named Jackie Estrada. You may know her. She's one of the, and she was quite close to Karl Barks and his wife, and interviewed them several times. Has a bunch of photos of them.
That's amazing, because it's interesting because the kind of books you've worked on, I feel as if you've purposely sometimes avoided the mainstream. You know, you don't want to end up, you know, working on just some bog standard monthly book. You know, I always felt you seem to veer towards interesting projects. And there's a few guys who've done this, and I think it gives you longevity. You know, instead of the grind of a monthly that you only, you know, you get fed up with or whatever, you always felt like a guy who was kind of picking his projects carefully, and they were all passion projects and everything. But it's interesting then that you didn't grow up in that Marvel DC thing the way that most pros did.
Well, that changed when I went to college, and some friends introduced me to Nick Furiation of S.H.I.E.L.D. By Steranko.
Yeah.
And Neil Adams, an X-Men. And I looked at that art and I said, holy shit, you know, this is not the comics I grew up on. This is visionary stuff. And later I was lucky enough to get to know those guys.
Yeah.
But I had no idea how to manage a career. If I did, I'd be a lot further along than I am today. On the other hand, I think I'm exactly where I should be. Yeah. And it's a long, convoluted story. But there was a period in there for about 10 years in the 90s and into the early 2000s where I couldn't get any writing work whatsoever. And I took any job I could. I was a janitor. I unloaded automobile bumpers, whatever I could to support myself and my wife at the time, because she was the reason we moved out here. She was, she felt that she was ill, and she was ill because she was a lifelong alcoholic and pill popper.
Right.
And she said, we have to move out there or I'm going to die. So we moved out here. And then in 2006, she did die. She died of an overdose of Oxycontin and vodka.
Oh my God.
And I found her when I came home, and, you know, I was seeing a psychiatrist at the time for problems. And when I saw him a couple weeks later, he said, tell me the truth, Mike. Doesn't this come as a little bit of a relief? And he was right. And since then, I've married again to a wonderful woman who supports me totally. And she won't even take an aspirin.
Wow. That's crazy. That's amazing. And how long have you been married to your new wife? How long has that been? 15
years.
And that's interesting because that roughly ties in with you coming back into comics as well.
Well, it's a long and winding road, and I had stopped writing for a long time. But when I started again, seriously, and probably around 2010, I said, "Well, I'm going to take another try at these novels." And so I was working on a novel, and I was about a third of the way through it, and I just suddenly thought, "Holy shit!" You know, I know what I'm doing. I can see the story. I understand the story, and this is good stuff. And it's like I had passed through a desert and come to an oasis on the far side. And since then, I've been very proud of my writing. I try not to let anything out of the house that's not a home run.
Yeah.
And particularly in the last 5 years, since I've had the good fortune to hook up with some wonderful people who helped me, my career's taken off again. I'm busier than I ever have been in my life.
That's fantastic. That's great. And see, because, you've had a long career, you're going back really 50 years if you count your early 70s work, but 40 years as a well-known writer.
81 I started.
Yeah. Because, but Nexus and Badger kind of period up until now. Like, so you sound like you've had some tough times and everything, and I always wonder, like, do you think it's easier to work when your life is hard or when your life is easy?
Honestly, I think that when you're writing, you turn everything else off and you focus on the story.
Yeah.
And I've learned that a writer has to entertain himself before he can entertain others. He has to surprise himself before he can surprise others. And you know this, that when you create a really good character, at some point he's going to turn around and tell you what he's going to do next.
It takes on its own life. Because I think about, when Stephen King in the early 70s, late 60s, when he's, working in a laundry, and he's thinking about Carrie and everything, that sometimes a tough time in your life, weirdly, is when you escape, isn't it, into your own head, and that's when you kind of come up with great ideas as well. And then when the guys are sitting back in a pool in Hollywood and they're smoking cigars and all that, that's not always when the best stuff gets done,
Maybe. I went to the premiere of Carrie, the very first one with Sissy Spacek, who was at a theater in Boston. And when the show ended, some guy came out on stage and says, "And we'd like to thank the author, Mr. King." And he stood up. He was down in the audience. Yeah. I never met him. But I was a big fan of a lot of his books, up to a point, and then I think he lost the plot.
You must have been like, a young guy going to see Cat. I mean, how did you get a ticket for the premiere? What happened there?
How did I what?
How did you get a ticket for the premiere of Carrie? That's, back then, you're just starting out.
Well, I was music editor for the Boston Phoenix.
Right.
And I reviewed movies too. And how I came to be music editor, it's my first job out of college was smoking dope for the government. I moved to Boston because I heard about these newspapers, and I saw an ad in the back of the Boston Phoenix and said, volunteers needed, joint study, Institute of Mental Health and Harvard, effects of marijuana on the brain, live in a hospital ward for 30 days, smoke dope every day, and take a battery of tests. It was just like college. And when I got out, I wrote that up and I submitted it to the Boston Phoenix. Yeah. And they bought it. And then a couple of months later, I became their music editor.
That's amazing. I would be worried that was an undercover narc that was trying to catch guys who like dope, That's amazing. So, I mean, you sound like you've had such a varied life, So, like, what were you doing, like, between 74 and 81, when you had that indie comic thing in 74, and then 81, 82 when Eclipse Comics and things is all blown up? Like, what were you doing in that period then?
Well, I was grooving on the comics. I'm a huge underground fan. I love all those guys. Especially R. Crumb and Gilbert Shelton, Rick Griffin, those guys, they were visionaries. And it wasn't just the art. Their stories were compelling. And I think it's because they came from a very personal area. I moved back to Madison, Wisconsin in 77. Yeah. And that's where I met Steve Root. I was working at an insurance company at the time. Right. And that's probably the last regular job I ever had. I've been fired from every regular job I ever had. But anyhow, Madison is a real hotbed of underground activity, and they were head shops. And that's where they sold the comics. And I bought everything I could. And I still worship those comics. I collect the editions. I wish that I had met Crumb. I suppose there's still time. But, I think he's a genius, not just for his art, although his art is superb. When he wants to draw fine art, it's just brilliant. Yeah. But from for his courage in putting out there his id. I mean, he puts out stuff about sex and race that no one else would dare touch.
And he's kind of like Larry David in the sense that he's kind of untouchable, isn't he, as well? Like, nobody ever complains about Crumb's innermost thoughts.
Well, they banned him from Australia.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
They said, no, this guy's a pornographer. We're not going to let him into the country.
That's great. And what was Shelton? Did you ever hang out with Gilbert Shelton?
No, I wish I had. The one guy I knew very well was Dennis Kitchen, because we were friends in college. And when I moved back, he had started Kitchen Sink Publishing, and I wrote for him and contributed to a number of his magazines. And I got to work with Rand Holmes, who was a great underappreciated artist. He lived in Canada.
Yeah.
Do you know who Rand Holmes is?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he took Wally Wood's style and took it to the nth level. And that's what I always loved, that style. I'm fighting with fruit flies here. If you wonder what I'm doing is.
Did you catch that thing a couple of weeks ago that some guy had spent 10 years rebuilding Wally Wood's office?
No.
As a statue? Have you seen this? No?
No.
I'll send you a picture. It's amazing. Some guy basically saw some drawings of Wally Wood's office that he'd put in the back of a couple of his old strips, you know? And he was so mesmerized by it that he recreated it painstakingly in a kind of miniature version with Wally Wood's desk, the posters that he had on the wall, the light at the side of the desk, you know, the cigarette tray and everything. And it took him 10 years. And it's just this labour of love for no reason except that he loves it. And I love that. It's so great.
I think Larry Hama worked for Wally Wood.
Oh, really? Yeah. And so when you were starting out, were the Eclipse guys like a gang? You know, the way the Marvel guys hung out, the DC guys would know each other and everything? Or were you guys spread all over? Or
we were spread all over. I mean, Eclipse was headquartered in California.
Yeah.
I'm trying to recall if I did anything for them. Maybe our very first story, the dude and I, what we wrote is a story called Encyclopedias, about this guy trying to sell encyclopedias door to door in a post-nuclear Holocaust city. and ever since then, I mean, kicking myself because nobody would buy a big set of books these days because we have the internet. And I failed to anticipate the internet. And, I mean, who could have imagined? But was that Eclipse? No, that was Pacific. It was Pacific Comics. Yeah. I don't think I've ever published anything with Eclipse. I
thought you started with Eclipse and then went to Pacific.
No, our first publisher was Capital in Madison, Wisconsin.
Because there was a lot of those small publishers around that time, wasn't there? And I guess it was because the direct market had created the opportunity for these guys. So they all those fans from the 60s were suddenly able to run their own company, you know. And so how did you find Pacific to work with? What were they like?
They always treated me fairly. I have no complaints with Pacific. I don't think we did anything beyond that encyclopedia story. We were just getting started. Yeah. And as my opportunities opened up and I started writing for Marvel or DC, other companies started contacting me, and I ended up writing for Malibu. I did some great stuff for them, and eventually Valiant. And it was after that I fell out of the industry, and that was nobody's fault but my own. I didn't understand how to sustain a career.
How do you think you do that? How do you think you sustain?
Well, you stick with the big companies. And if I'd been smart, I would have done that. But I felt, well, I can do my own stuff and it'll be better. And well, I did do my own stuff and some of it was better. But it wasn't as good as what I've been producing for the last 20 years. As I said, I went through that trial by fire because DC offered me a 7-year contract. Dick Giordano did. And I thought about it. And I thought, oh, man, no, I can do better just freelancing. And that was a big mistake on my part. But it may have been that I overestimated my writing ability because now the point is to grab the reader by the throat and draw him into the narrative to the exclusion of all else. Because if you write a vital, exciting, memorable, funny, heartbreaking comic, people will buy it. They'll remember it. They'll read it over and over again. They'll tell other people. But most people aren't doing that, as you know.
But the period at DC, I think it was maybe 86 you came in and did The Flash, 86 came into 87. Like, Giordano was riding so high at that point. I mean, everybody he was working with was brilliant. Like, you're talking about 10% of comics being good. I think back then it was higher. I mean, that period, mid-80s, was astonishing. Like, some great indie books, some great Marvel, some great DCs, When did Dick first approach you then to come to DC? When did he actually have a first conversation with you?
Well, let me think. First of all, Carl Potts called me up around 87. And I think it was because he'd been reading Badger. He said, Mike, I think you could write our Punisher book.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah. And then Mike Gold was my editor at First Comics. Because from Capital, we went to First.
Yeah.
And Mike Gold was my editor there. And then he was offered a job at DC. So Mike called me and said, Mike, I'd like you to write The Flash. And I said, all right. So I had a couple of good insights and I wrote it for about a year. And then I ran out of ideas. And see, this is one of the mistakes I made. This wouldn't happen today. Run out of ideas. The idea is abhorrent to me. I never run out of ideas today. But I did then. I said, Mike, I don't know what to do with the character. I'm going to have to give it up. And without that sinecure, that tethered position on an anchor character, I was flitting from title to title. One of those was Dead Man.
Yes, I think it was an Action Comics you were doing Dead Man, wasn't it?
Yes, and when Kelly and I started doing those graphic novels, that's when Kelly became Kelly Jones, and that's the work at DC I'm proudest of. Yeah. But I did a bunch of other titles, Hawk and Dove, and some other stuff I can't even remember. And there are a lot of books back there I wish I could claw back because I don't think that I was the writer then that I am today. And then I look at him and I say, oh, no, oh, man, this is terrible.
I think your Flash run was great. I really loved it. I remember at the time, Marv Wolfman was over in Glasgow, where I lived, and he was giving a talk, and he was talking about the idea of post-crisis. They were going to reinvent, that Giordano wanted them to reinvent all the characters. And they were talking about the idea of doing the Flash not as a super speed guy. It was going to be something entirely different, And I remember not liking the sound of this. It was going to be something different powers and all this kind of thing. And then your thing seemed like a relief, when I saw it was the Flash and Wally West. It kind of felt like a real person, which I thought was interesting. You had him having an affair with a married woman, winning the lottery and all that, just stuff you'd never seen in a superhero comic before. So where did all that come from? Did DC just give you a kind of license to do what you liked? Like just a fun?
Yeah. It's funny because I can barely remember any incidents of editorial interference for anything I wrote for Marvel or DC. Every now and then they say, well, you don't want to use this name because that's a real product and we could get in trouble. And that's about it. And, the Punisher was completely hands off with Carl. Yeah, but I had a handle from that right from the Jump Street, and my insight was that Punisher was a pure crime comic. And for 3 years there were no flying saucers, time travel, dinosaurs, or anything like that. Yeah. He interacted with the Kingpin, Doc Doom, and Daredevil, but they're kind of street level characters. I mean, Doc Doom elevated himself, but he was just a man inside that armor. But
that was a great run as well. I think. Politically, would I be right in thinking you're probably conservative mostly, aren't you? Which I think works great on the Punisher. Like Chuck Dixon's the same. And I think there's a zeal to the Punisher when it's written by a conservative. I think like Frank Castle seems to be enjoying what he's doing, and the writers enjoying writing what Frank Castle's doing.
Well, I was so appalled by what Marvel has done with the Punisher that I created a title called Private American. Which is for sale on my website, and we're debating whether to do the second issue because I had written a second issue, but the second issue was predicated on the theory that things were going to go along as they have been with all these parasites controlling the government, and now everything has changed. So if we are going to do a second issue, I'm going to have to rewrite about half that book.
It's interesting actually because Disney Marvel obviously are less excited by the Punisher than they are by more family-friendly things and everything. You definitely felt the Punisher was getting moved to one side. Myself and a whole bunch of different creators have all been talking over the last couple of years saying, yeah, we're trying to occupy that same space because I do think there's a gap in the market for a book about a guy with guns who has simple solutions to difficult problems because audiences do like that, don't they?
Well, they always will. They're always going to love vigilante movies. It's so American. And there are dozens of independent comics that are coming out that are vigilante based, like USA Assassin and The Horseman, which Chuck is doing for Rippaverse.
Yeah. Hello there. Do you love big, expensive hardcovers? So do I. We've got a whole ton of them coming up. The first one out is October for a collection, oversized, of Wanted and Big Game. Coming in December, you have The Ambassadors with the greatest living comic book artists. I'm talking Frank Whiteley, Olivier Coipel, Matteo Scalera, just all your favourites. You've got to check this out. And in January, the big one, The Magic Order, collecting Volumes 1 and Volumes 2 of the original series. Art by Olivier Coipel and Stuart Immonen. Story by me. You're going to love it.
Come here, baby. Give us a cameo. My wife's going to make it. She can do a cameo here. Her name is Ann. This is Mark Millar, baby.
Okay. Hi, Ann. How you doing? Good to see you.
Mark. Okay.
Nice to meet you. my wife quite often appears at the beginning of the videos, and she's setting everything up for me because even after 4 years of using these things, I've still no idea what I'm doing. You know, so you always going to see her for a second at the beginning, or one of my kids.
I'm the same way.
So to go back a little bit to, you growing up then, so, if you got into comics when you were at college, were you not into George Reeves' Superman and all that kind of stuff? Was that not a thing for you?
Not George Reeves. I suppose I saw 1 or 2 episodes. When I'm watching it, even as a kid, I know, well, this is cheesy. I don't believe a man can fly. This is just a guy hanging by guy wires with a fan in his face. It wasn't until Christopher Reeve that technology got to the point where you could believe a man could fly.
Yeah.
And of course, that original Superman movie with Christopher Reeves set the bar very high.
Yeah. And it's funny, I was talking to someone, a Zoom call earlier today. We were just saying that what really made that and Tim Burton's Batman work as well was it was the first time between 1938 and the year 2000 that like a proper director was working on these properties, because this is what's kind of been a bit of a problem in the last few years in superhero cinema is if you don't have somebody who's really brilliant at what they do, superheroes look terrible on screen. Whereas if you have a Richard Donner, a Tim Burton, a Sam Raimi, a Christopher Nolan, it can look fantastic because these guys are so sure of what they're doing.
I've been meaning to rewatch that first Batman's, the one. I'm blanking
Batman
out.
Begins.
The one you just mentioned, the director.
Nolan's Batman.
No, not Nolan.
Oh, Tim Burton's one.
Tim Burton, that's right.
Yeah.
Tim Burton.
I bet it holds up great. I mean, that movie's 35 years old, but I remember at the time it was insane, but it was a quality director coming on doing this stuff. So it was great. So you didn't...
And the key to its success, this is the key to success in so much entertainment, is it takes itself seriously. Sure, there's a lot of goofy stuff in there, but it's not nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And that's the death of a story, especially if you're dealing in certain genres. A story has to take itself seriously before the audience can take it seriously.
Yes. Yeah. The characters have got to believe it, haven't they? That's what makes this, there's got to be a sincerity, I think, in there, isn't there?
Absolutely. It's even more important in fantasy. But I mean, there are outliers just like Blazing Saddles and Airplane and movies like that, which you understand that's just going to be an explosion of gags one after the other. They're going to throw everything against the wall and see what sticks.
I think what's different with them, though, is when you do a parody, a comedy about a serious genre, like an airport disaster or or Cowboys, then you're poking fun at something that's normally po-faced. Whereas superheroes is such an intrinsically silly idea that a comedy about superheroes is too much, isn't it? It doesn't quite work in the same way.
What's that movie? Is based on a Bob Burden comic about these goofy heroes.
Exactly that, yeah.
And that's actually funny.
Yeah, but audiences didn't quite click. It was Mystery Men, it didn't hit that mass audience that when you take superheroes a little more seriously, like you still got to have a smile in it as well. Like Sam Raimi had a great balance with those Spider-Man movies, But if it goes too silly, I think the mainstream audience pushes back, don't they?
Well, I haven't seen a comedy in years. It's actually, no, that's not true. I have seen a couple of very funny comedies. One is Hitman on Netflix about a mild-mannered university professor who moonlights as an informer for the FBI. But what he really does is he says, he answers these people who are looking for an assassin for hire. Have you seen that?
I'm quite friendly with Glenn Powell, the guy who's in it, and it's a terrific film. Glenn wrote it as well. He and Richard Linklater wrote it together, It's a great movie. He's a proper movie star as well. I mean, this guy came out of nowhere, it seems, and suddenly, he's everywhere. He's great.
Yeah, that's one of the few funny movies I've seen in recent times.
Yeah, it's a really likable film, actually, isn't it? It's good. But
Is he in the States?
Well, sorry, what's that?
Does he live in the United States?
He's actually in Scotland right now. Strangely, he's shooting a movie in Scotland with Edgar Wright. You know the Stephen King book, The Running Man?
Yes.
He's doing an adaptation of The Running Man in my home city, like where I used to live. He's there right now.
Great.
So it's funny, my home city, we're always quite proud because they shot some Indiana Jones there, they shot some Batman there and everything, they shot World War Z there. And then we realised that all the places they were using it for was a science fiction dystopia of the most terrifying place you could live, So it seemed a bit less cool,
If they could afford to, they could film in LA now and get the same effect.
It's a shame because 90% of productions used to be in LA and now it's flipped. It's the other way. Only 10% of productions are in LA. They're using Glasgow.
Yeah, they chased everybody out.
Yeah.
I got this Sherlock Holmes book we're campaigning for.
Yes, so that's actually an active thing right now, though, isn't it? People can actually back it at the moment. Yeah.
I sent you a link to the campaign. Have you seen the video?
Yes, we're going to stick it in the bottom of the video here as well, so people can, for anybody watching it, you just go one down and this will be the first thing. You can click on to back it.
Thank you, sir.
So how's it come together for you? Are you happy with it?
I'm happy with the product. I made a mistake here. I thought that the independent comic crowd would go for it in a big way, but they're not. And I realized in retrospect, the people that buy crowdfunded comics want superheroes, monsters, dinosaurs, science fiction, flying saucers, and tits. And Sherlock Holmes doesn't fall anywhere on the target. So it's a hard sell. And mostly, and then I started getting into all these Sherlock Holmes groups on Facebook and elsewhere. They're all over the internet. There are thousands of them. And started interacting with them. And they're great people and they're very enthusiastic, but they're mostly not a comic book crowd.
Yes, yeah. Does it cross over at all? Do you think some of them are going to come over for it?
I don't know, because when I was on one group chat and we were all on video, most of them looked older than me. And I'm so old, I saw Hendrix. But other groups seem enthusiastic. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has written 3 Mycroft Holmes graphic novels. I'm going to order one. Yeah. And I suspect they're pretty good, but that's how popular Holmes is. It's just he's not that popular in the comic book world.
I always saw Sherlock Holmes like Tarzan or Lone Ranger or Superman, just one of the great fictional characters, that I've always loved it. Have you seen The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, the Billy Wilder movie?
Yes, I have. I'd like to watch it again. It's a highly worthwhile production. And one of the reasons is it examines one of those questions that all Sherlock Holmes aficionados wonder about is regarding his private life. What's his problem with intimacy? Has he ever had a relationship with a woman?
Yeah.
And that goes unspoken. But I think there's an understanding among modern people that the character, Sherlock Holmes, suffers from Asperger's syndrome, which, as you know, prevents intimacy with other human beings, but often compensates for it in another field. Yeah. But as you read Sherlock Holmes and you go through the work as it becomes as Conan Doyle wrote and became older and the character became older and matured, he learned to care for other people, especially people who came to him in good faith and had honestly been wronged. And so their concerns become his concerns. And he evinces his humanity that way.
So what is the basic take then for the book? Where in Holmes's life does your story take place?
It would occur in the late 80s, and in it, he teams up with Captain Nemo to prevent a worldwide war that's being instigated by the Tsar of Russia, who's hired a madman who's kind of the mirror image of Nemo, and that he has this skyship he built that can fly anywhere without refueling. And the Tsar hires him to rain hellfire on his enemies. And if that continues, then everybody's going to be forced into world war. He's going to be attacking England, He'll attack Russia, or excuse me, he's in Russia. He'll attack Japan, Korea, China, and they'll all be forced to fight back.
That's really interesting because that world of Jules Verne crossing over with Arthur Conan Doyle is such a lovely idea, isn't it? Like they actually fit. It doesn't feel too much of a culture smash or anything. Those fit. They blend really well, don't they?
No, and that's the beautiful thing about all these great Victorian characters is that they lend themselves to interacting with each other. We've all seen The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And you mentioned Tarzan before. And Tarzan is a character that's not only huge in pulps, but he's huge in comics and movies. And comic fans will go for Tarzan because he's tangential to Conan the Barbarian. As far as comics go, I think that Conan's the gold standard for the type of half-naked noble savage. But Tarzan is a different character because he's erudite. He was educated in British schools. He knows how to speak. He doesn't grunt. Yeah. But he swings from vine to vine, and he fights lions. So that's what people want, and ancient civilizations.
Tarzan's a weird combination of Batman and Superman a little bit as well in terms of that mythic quality as well, where he's orphaned, his parents have been killed and so on, but he also has that aristocratic Bruce Wayne thing, even though he's out in the jungle, but he's also a fish out of water in that Superman sense as well, But all these characters, they feel as if they've got similar DNA, don't they? Doc Savage, of course, as well,
Philip Jose Farmer is one of my favorite writers, was obsessed with Tarzan and Doc Savage, whom he called Lord Tiger and Doc Caliban. He wrote his own novels about them and created the Wold Newton universe where they all interact with other Victorian characters of the era and with real people. Are you a Farmer fan?
Oh, yeah, of course. I discovered them. There was a book called Weird Heroes that had a bunch of famous comic guys drawing the stuff, while a bunch of famous kind of writers like Farmer, Harlan Ellison, and these guys all wrote some short stories. And that was my kind of entry point. Comics kind of led me into that late 60s, early 70s sci-fi fantasy kind of world and pulps, Did you ever come across any of that stuff? Like Neil Adams and Steranko and all that? Like we're drawing the books?
No, I'll have to ask Jim about that. I'd love to see that. Because, I'm a huge Steranko fan. And I knew Harlan. We visited his house once when I was at the San Diego Comic-Con, and he was showing, and by us, I mean, it was me and a guy who created the Golden Apple Shop in Los Angeles. And he's showing us these secret rooms. He says, and these are my, and then a couple of years later, I designed and built my own house. And I thought, well, it would be cool if I had a few secret passages. So I put a trap door in the floor of my bedroom closet that led to the basement via ladder. And then years later, I was dating a woman, and we were not in our right minds, and I showed her the trap door and forgot about it. And then we were going to leave for dinner, so I went upstairs and I stepped into my bedroom closet and fell to the basement and cracked my hip. So I had to have a hip replacement. And then people asked me, how did that happen? And I said, well, it was inspired when we toured Harlan Ellison's house, and he showed us his secret rooms. And then a couple of days later, I get a phone call. I pick it up and say, hello. Ellison is at fault? Ellison is the reason you broke your hip?
I love it when people do geeky stuff in their house. Like I heard, I won't name names because I heard this from another friend, but there's a famous comic writer who built Bruce Wayne's library from the Batman TV show in his house, so it's the same wood paneled walls, the bust of William Shakespeare, the red phone. And you flip the head back and you press a button and the library walls slide back and there's two poles. And he's got his name and his wife's name on the two poles. And then he slides down the poles to his basement where he has another office that's kitted out exactly like the Batcave, the 60s Batcave. And he's got a perfect replica of the 60s Batmobile sitting there as well.
Oh, man, I would love to see that.
So cool, so cool.
So would everybody.
But I feel I can never go public because I heard it secondhand, but my friend swears by it. He slid down the poles. He slid down the poles with him and said it was the greatest moment of his life.
You got it. I would ask him if he wore gloves.
So that's so Jose Farmer. So I can see your influences. Then you're coming in from that 70s sci-fi world and everything. Then did you get into Farmer in college? Then
No, I discovered Farmer when I was hitchhiking across England. Believe it or not.
All right.
We went to England in the 70s. A bunch of us from the University of Wisconsin. And I picked up one of his World of Tears novels in an English bookshop, and I read it, and I was just hooked. I thought, this guy's got the greatest imagination ever. I loved the idea, and it was influential on me, especially on the bowl-shaped world which I wrote for Nexus, where he teams up with the Badger, and I think that's in the early teens of the Nexus numbering.
Because Farmer actually lived until quite recently, didn't he? He lived until like 10, 15 years ago. He made it to his 90s, I think. He was around. Was he still writing when he was very old, or was it mainly 20, 30 years ago?
I'll have to look, because if he was, I'd be interested in reading those. I have a huge box of his books that I collected over the years, including the ones I picked up in England.
Right. Did you get into Michael Moorcock or any of those guys and everything as well?
Who?
Michael Moorcock. Did you get into any of that stuff? Like Jerry Cornelius and all those kind of things?
I'm not familiar.
Oh, really? Yeah. A lot of that stuff, if you were into one thing, you tended to be into the other, I discovered a lot of that stuff. There's always like some guy in your neighborhood who's a little bit older and he's got all these books, that he gets you into, So I was lucky enough to have a few people like that around when I was growing up, So sorry, you were saying, could you give us a basis of the Sherlock Holmes story then? Could you?
It starts out with Holmes is spiraling out of control because he doesn't have anything to occupy him. When the shipping magnate comes to his house and says, Mr. Holmes, my last two freighters bearing ore from Argentina have sunk without a trace. I would like you to find out the reason why. And Holmes says, well, I don't go out on the water, sir. But the shipping magnate says, I will give you a Stradivarius violin. So Holmes agrees. And it turns out that the only survivor was from the second ship, who was found a week later clinging to the underside of a overturned lifeboat, raving out of his mind. He was raving, a monster from the deep. And so they visit him at Bedlam, and he's just talking crazy talk. But Holmes agrees to take the case, and he and Watson board a freighter that's going from Liverpool to St. Petersburg by way of Malmo, Sweden. And they take off, and somewhere between the British Isles and Scandinavia, the monster attacks and rams the boat, and they're all in the water and the subsurfaces, and they get on board, and that's how they meet. And of course, Nemo says, once on, never off. You're stuck here forever. Right. But Holmes says, well, I don't know about that. And they start talking, and they realize that they both have a lot in common. They're both geniuses. They both disdain the world the way it is. And Holmes doesn't have any drugs on the boat. And he says, what am I going to do? And Nemo says, this is my library. And he's got books that are 10-foot tall, shelves of books, everything. And he hands Holmes a book of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. And Holmes starts reading. He's just enthralled. And that keeps him busy until they make landfall. And along the way, Irene Adler appears. She first boarded the ship disguised as an Irishman whose personal hygiene was so horrible nobody would approach him because he stank so bad and he's all lumped up with these clothes. So nobody had any idea it was a woman except for Holmes. And the reason he knew she was a woman is he saw her looking at her nails. Right. A woman always looks at her nails like
women
this.
Do that, don't they? Men do. It's this or this, isn't it? That's the
Oh, she's looking at her nails like this. That's right, like this. And men look at their nails like this. And so he knew who she was, and he waits for her to go ashore and come back as Irene Adler before he approaches her. And it turns out she's working for the Tsar, and she arranged for this shipment of ore. And there was an agreement that she would be saved if they sank the ship, but they sink the ship after she gets off and comes back on. So she survives. And then they proceed to St. Petersburg, where they meet the Tsar, who's crazier than a shithouse rat. And he tells them about his scheme to conquer all the other nations. And right then, there's revolutions going up in the Great Square because people are fed up with Tsarist rule, and they're rioting even then because they can't afford to eat.
Yeah.
And he says, well, I'll take care of that. Look to the skies. And they look to the skies, and this freakish, lighter-than-air ship floats over the scene and starts raining down hellfire on the crowds. And they realize that this is his secret weapon. So
I love that idea, mirroring the idea of Captain Nemo, a Nemo of the skies, you know. I think Jules Verne, he had a thing, was it Master of the World or something like that? There was something with an airship, wasn't there? Is it that kind of setup?
Yeah, you've got it. I mean, I don't want to say the name.
I won't go into it then.
for people who are not familiar with Verne, it'll come as a complete surprise. But people who are familiar with Verne will already have guessed who the bad guy is. But then he dispatches the bad guy to Kamchatka,
yeah,
as a stopping off point before he bombs Japan.
Right.
And they're aware of this, Nautilus, and Holmes says, well, can we beat him there? And Nemo says, we can beat him there by going under the Arctic ice pack. I can get there ahead of him. And so they do that, and they're forced to surface at the Arctic because those damn giant squids attack again. And there's somebody waiting for them there. I don't want to give anything away, but it's going to blow your mind. And it's integral to the story too. And
what kind of format does it take in terms of, is it going to continue, or is it like
it's one and done. It's one and done. And
how many pages?
72. 72 pages of story. Whether I do another one.
Then I feel if that was a modern comic, you know, from Marvel or DC, that would be 18 issues or something like that, you know.
Well, it's 3 issues, 3 24-page issues, because that's how I was taught to write. A standard comic story is 24 pages, and you can tell a lot of story in 24 pages if you understand the medium. And that doesn't mean you got to throw a lot of words at it, because the key to a successful comic is doling your words out like gold coins. The less you use, the more powerful they become, if you understand the medium, and if you know how to create dialogue that sounds real, that's arresting, that advances character. Occasionally, you're going to have dialogue advance the plot. That's necessary. It happens when you say, well, this is the plan, and you can't avoid that. But for the most part, you want to show, don't tell. And you want the story to advance visually as much as possible. And you use your words for characterization and occasionally to bring the reader up to speed on what's going on. But if you do it right, you don't have to do that often.
Denny O'Neil had a great line. He said, comic book dialogue, comic book writing should be newspaper headlines, but written by poets, which I love. It's so good. You know?
That's good. Yeah, it's good. And it's true, because the first time we saw words like a face a tiger, you just hit the jackpot, or it's clobbering time, they had an impact. Because it was the first time and the context was right. And so they've stayed with us forever. Unfortunately, a lot of people who write and even get paid for it haven't learned that you have to be original, which is my third rule of writing. Number 1, entertain. Number 2, show, don't tell. Number 3, be original. I mean, how many times have you read, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore? We have to talk.
But you've got a great perspective. Like, most comic careers last between 10 and 20 years, I think, if you look back at history. But you've actually been around as a professional writer for like half the length of time the industry has been there, you know? So, like, what do you think you've learned as a writer? You know, because you're happier now, it sounds, than anything you've ever been in terms of work. How do you think you've grown as a writer?
I've learned what story is. And as you know, you can't sum it up in a phrase, because it's so many things. But I had a great writer. His name was Jerry McNeely. And he said, you make them laugh a little bit. You make them cry a little bit. You scare the hell out of them, and that's entertainment. And that's as good as a capsule description of what storytelling is as I've ever heard. But as you know, it's so much more than that. It's the details, the intricacies, the plot, the device, the words, the setting. It's a million things. Whatever adds to the story. And as long as you understand what constitutes story, you're not going to take a wrong step.
Yeah.
You know, and if you don't know what happens next, you stop.
Mm-hmm.
And you turn to something else. I very rarely run into roadblocks these days because I know when to stop and let the subconscious take over. I can't tell you how often I've woken up in the middle of the night and thought, holy shit, that's it. That's the key to the story. And that's why I keep a pen and a pad next to my bed.
But your subconscious mind will solve problems that your conscious mind is stuck in, isn't there? Like, I remember when I was in high school, one of my maths teachers said to me, if you're struggling with an equation or whatever, you know, and you're in the middle of a test, just set it to one side. Don't beat yourself up over it. Go and do something else. Finish that page and then go back and your subconscious will have taken care of that problem. And it was absolutely right. And it's the same with writing too, isn't it? Even when you're in the supermarket or whatever, when you're chatting to people even, you know, your subconscious mind's doing all the hard work. Right?
Good advice.
Do you ever block out your stories though? Do you never sort of plan ahead, or do you?
No. When I started writing, I just would wing it. I wrote for 20 years by drawing each page out by hand.
Right.
And I'm no great artist, but I'm good enough that anybody can tell at a glance what I'm drawing, whether it's a spaceship or a sailing ship or a close-up of a guy or two guys fighting or an ancient civilization in the jungle. You can tell that's what I'm drawing. And I would draw in all the word balloons, all the dialogue that appears on the page, and what few directions I felt that the artist needed. And when you draw the picture out by hand, you don't need to give the artist a lot of directions. It was an invaluable lesson, and I would urge anybody who wants to do comics to try it, whether they can draw or not. You draw that first panel out. You can use stick figures, you use squares or whatever. You can use a little crude perspective, which I did. And once you start, you got to make a good beginning. It's like when you're writing a novel, how do I begin the novel? Well, I don't worry about that anymore because there's a million ways to do it and grab the reader's attention. But once you start, you do that first panel, and then I would think, what happens next? And I would look at the next panel and I think, what is the logical extension? What's exciting? What's entertaining? What will not beggar belief? And so I proceeded from the first page to the last like an inchworm, crawling from panel to panel. And I would see things opening up ahead. I said, well, in 2 pages, we're going to have a big fight scene.
Yeah.
And when that happens, you know, as you know, a comic has a pulse and a rhythm all its own, and it depends on the number of panels you have per page, the number of words. And there's a time for 6 panels per page, and there's a time when you open it up and you use the whole page for a single image. I very rarely do that because I think when that happens, and no matter how great the werewolf is that you're looking at, you stop right there and you're staring at the werewolf. And that's why I usually will devote the top 4/5 of a page to a single image. And down at the bottom, I'll have a tier which goes, and next, and there's some intrigue there to cause you to turn the page. And forgive me if I repeat myself, but that's the most important question in literature is what happens next. Because if the reader doesn't care, he's not going to turn the page.
That's really interesting because as comics has become more fan-orientated probably since the 70s, the splash page and the double page spread is just expected, isn't it? But strangely, the 60s and before, you almost never got a splash page. I mean, you can think of hardly any, you know, like any old Spider-Man comic or whatever, you know, it's rare, you know, to the point where I can remember the splash pages because they were so infrequent.
Well, if they want a splash page, I would just as soon do a movie poster type homage, adding all the elements of the story, the hero, the heroine, the spaceships in the background, the rats crawling up from below, as you would see in a movie poster. And then you turn the page and the story begins on page 2. Right,
yeah. That's really interesting. But do you never worry about pacing then? You know, because I block everything out and I know my first scene and my last scene grow the whole thing as a story, and I have it on a board. I mean, over there, I've got a drafting board where I have every scene all planned. But I'd worry, think the pace was too quick in the middle and too slow at the end and everything. Do you just have an instinctive thing, if it's right or not?
Well, I do have good instincts, and I have the dramatic structure imprinted on my head, as I'm sure you do too. But I forgot to mention that and I never used to outline anything, but now I'm a firm believer in outlining. But my outline has two purposes. One is to show me where I'm going in the story. Number two is to excite interest. So I write those outlines so that I can hand it to anyone, and they're going to read the outline, and they're not going to put it down. They can't stop reading until the end, and they're not that long, maybe a page. But what I want them to finish the outline and look at me and say, holy shit, where do I get the book?
Right. That's interesting. That's really interesting. Because I used to work that way, but then I found I was taking so many diversions that I would chop and go back and I didn't know the path that I was on, so I would take the wrong path a couple of times, but I found it quite helpful to do the blocking. But maybe that takes away spontaneity though as well. The spontaneity is more organic if you do it that way.
Well, I enjoy writing the outline because, as I said, you got to entertain yourself. And when I think of an idea, if that idea is good, and doesn't mean it's a hackneyed idea. I like new ideas or putting things together that didn't occur to me before. But work. I mean, and then I say, I know I'm on the right track. And as you know, I don't know if this is true for you, it's certainly true for me. The perfect ending should come as both a complete surprise and, in retrospect, inevitable.
Do you never reverse engineer your story from your ending? Because I sometimes do that. I'll have my ending and then I work backwards from the ending,
No, I don't. But when I'm writing something, I range backward and forward constantly, putting things in sync. I don't know if this happens to you, but I'll bet it does. That you'll introduce a character early on in the story because somebody has to come in the door with the mail or whatever.
Yes.
And then when you get towards the end of the book, that character becomes integral to the solution.
See, I'm kind of the opposite, but I use them as the solution to the problem and then set them up in the first issue, So it's not too much of a cheat. That's interesting, because I think crime fiction, especially whodunits and things, they tend to be written backwards because your ending is so important and you reverse engineer the whole thing, leaving the clues. But maybe adventure is better going forward, so you're constantly, surprised at the peril,
Well, when I write a story, there are certain givens, and one is that the hero will triumph and evil will be punished, and that's not always the case. But there is a book called On Moral Fiction by John Gardner. He's a great writer, and in it he wrote, the reader will feel cheated if he gets to the end of the book and evil is rewarded and good is punished. And there are exceptions to this, like George MacDonald Fraser's Flashman series, which is just pure fun. It's told from the villain's point of view. And of course,
the Flashman books are amazing.
And Cormac McCarthy, whose books are about some of the most vile human beings on earth, but you can't look away because it's so fascinating. But generally, you want good to triumph. And there are exceptions. There are books that stick to that rule, but still cause immense suffering for the hero. And I think of the end of Spartacus, when Spartacus is up on the cross dying, and his wife goes by in a cart and holds up their baby son for him to see. And he says, my heritage is secure. My line will go on. I have done something worthwhile.
I think it depends on the genre too, because horror, I think, needs an unhappy ending to work, doesn't it? Like The Omen had to have the kid turn around and smile at you at the end. The Exorcist had to have the priest break his neck, falling down the stairs, So horror, weirdly, the covenant with the audience is you leave feeling upset and disturbed in a strange way, don't you? Like a happy horror ending. And same with comedy, because comedy and horror is quite similar, isn't it? Comedy kind of works if it's a slightly unhappy ending as well, doesn't it?
Well, I think that the best comedy arises out of what I call the juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane, and that means absurdity. The absurdity of two things that don't belong together, coming together. And I'm sure you know what I mean. Uh, and there are horror comedies that work, like The Fearless Vampire Hunters by Roman Polanski. But most horror comedies are neither scary nor funny. I mean, I was waiting for Cocaine Bear. I thought, man, this is great, because a movie about a serious movie, a movie that took itself seriously about a bear that snorts cocaine going after people, that could be absolutely terrifying. And then it comes out it was nothing. You know, it wasn't funny, it wasn't scary, it was just silly, nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Mm-hmm. But I think the beats of comedy and the beats of horror and the structure, you know, it's strangely similar. It's creating this outrageous reaction from the audience as well. I don't mean blending them, I just mean as separate genres. They use a lot of the same tricks, don't they? Because an audience watching a horror or a comedy looks quite different to an audience watching a thriller. You know, they have a different expression on their face, don't they?
Yeah, especially in movies. Very few horror movies are honestly scary. And by that, I mean, they lay the ice cold finger on your spine with a fear of something that's unknowable and unfathomable that exists just beyond the range of human experience. I'm talking about the supernatural. They have to make you believe in the supernatural. The Exorcist does that. And so does Exorcist 3 for that matter.
Oh, it's one of the greatest movies ever made, Exorcist 3, I think. I watched it again recently. My sister was very ill last year, and to cheer her up, I would go out and see her. And I would bring her a horror film every week, and we'd sit and watch a horror film together. And my sister loves horror films, you know, and we would just sit and watch a DVD of a horror film. And one of the movies was Exorcist 3. And she'd never seen it, weirdly. It was a movie, because she didn't like the second one, so she didn't bother watching the third one, you know. And I'd forgotten just how frightening it is. It's absolutely terrifying, isn't it? And I think being a Catholic, especially, as a Catholic,
absolutely
has that extra little thing, doesn't it?
I saw The Exorcist in a movie theater in Mexico City once, many years ago, and of course the audience was entirely Catholic, and the reactions that you got there was deafening when they whoa. Another one is The Changeling, starring George C. Scott. Have you seen that?
I took that for my sister to watch that as well. Like, you know, we did she was having chemotherapy for a little while. And I went out every week for 3 months, and we watched all the best horror movies in that time. The Changeling I'd never seen at the time, so I just saw it for the first time recently. You know, I loved it. It's a great movie.
Yeah, that's another one that lays that ice cold finger on your spine.
Yeah, and I think George C. Scott is a perfect example as well of, like, you know, taking a genre thing seriously, because he's a proper actor, isn't he? Like, he's not some lightweight cheapo actor. You know, he's like an Oscar-winning kind of guy, isn't he? So having him in a horror film, when he's scared, we're scared, because he's not the kind of guy who scares easily. You know?
Yeah, he was great.
Really good. But let me ask you before we go about the crowdfunding itself, like, what led you into that world? Because it's such a fascinating means of selling comics, isn't it? Like, I mean, it kind of came out of nowhere, out of necessity for a lot of people, you know, who weren't working at the Marvel or DC or whatever, you know. And then this incredible success, in a lot of cases, has come from it as well. So what was your path that led you into crowdfunding?
Well, I crowdfunded a couple of novels with the help of my wife Anne, a Nexus novel and a Badger novel, and then one comic book called Cue Ball, and then I wrote a novel called Florida Man for Wolfpack, my publisher, and they specialize in adventure, spy, and westerns. And so I didn't expect them to publish it. I just wanted the publisher to suggest a publisher. She said, I'll publish it. It's by far my most successful novel. It's pure humor. I guarantee you'll laugh out loud. Everybody who reads it says that. They say, one guy said, I had to pull over to the side of the road. I was listening to it on audio, and I was laughing so hard I couldn't see. And another guy said, my wife kicked me out of bed because I wouldn't shut up. After I had written 2 of those novels, I decided to adapt them into a graphic novel because I thought it was a natural fit. Yeah. And I started working on it, and I don't know how I hooked up with Chris Sprawley, who's the man behind Bleeding Fool. And Chris is a professional videographer and a huge comic fan. And he said, well, hey, let me help you crowdfund this. So we started working together. And Chris has changed my life, really, because he's in charge of all my crowdfunded graphic novels so far, they've had varying degrees of success, and they've mostly been pretty gratifying. I'm pretty sure Bronze Star 2 is going to do a lot better than Bronze Star 1, because when people got their hands on Bronze Star and they read it, they said, holy shit, this is the real deal. And the second one's going to be even better. And I can't stop talking about Pat Broderick, because it's so unusual for an artist of his age to achieve unprecedented heights of excellence in his art. We sent you the black and white version, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan. I've always loved Pat Broderick, but he's a guy who's not dimmed at all as the years have gone on. He's actually better than he's ever been, I think.
It's astonishing, and we're excited about that. But anyhow, so I started working with Chris, and we had problems with the artists. The artist who originally agreed to do the book was uncooperative, and we had to replace him, and we did this, that, and the other thing. But we got it done. And people didn't mind the shifts in art, because it was Florida Man after all. But most importantly, the laughs in it were real, and they were gut busters. And people read that book and they said, I can't believe you put this in a book after they're done laughing. So that was a big success. And then we did a couple more, and then we did the second Florida Man graphic novel, which is even better than the first. I think it's a lot better. And now we're working on the third, and that's going to be the best of all. And by the best, I mean it's funny. I think it's the funniest stuff I've ever written for a comic book script, and we'll see what the reaction is. But that's a way down the road, because I think Bronze Star is going to be next. And also we're putting out a massive Nexus compendium, a hardbound edition. It's going to collect every comic, every Nexus comic from the number one for Capital Comics all the way through to the last material we did for Dark Horse.
How many pages is that?
Well, I think that each book is probably going to be 350 to 400 pages, so we're going to do 4 books.
That's going to be great. That's going to be great. And do you know, I wonder with crowdfunding, like how do you promote it generally? Generally, because there's almost no comic websites anymore, isn't there? We've got these YouTube channels and everything, but do you have a Substack that people kind of like?
I do have a Substack, mikebaron.substack.com. I don't usually promote my books there. I do sometimes when I have one funny, but I talk about all sorts of things there. I talk about things that are of interest to me, people that I meet that are fascinating. How do I promote it? Well, I reach out to people like you.
So it's the YouTube.
I've been lucky to be embraced by the Comicsgate Kings. I'm the only Comicsgate King writer. The rest are all artists, and they have huge followings because they were at the peak of their careers when they left.
Right.
Generally for irreconcilable differences, and because they weren't welcome. And we all know the reasons why. And they include Ethan Van Sciver, Graham Nolan, Billy Tucci, Aaron Lopresti, Shane Davis, John Malin. These are guys who are world-class artists. And so they have a big following to begin with. And a number of them, like Ethan and Shane Davis, they do all their fundraising on their own platforms, and they're always hitting 6 figures.
So do those books, are they available 2 years down the line from, print press and stores? Can people go into bookstores and get the stuff later? Or?
Well, in the case of my books, they can, because we have been remarketing them through regular comic publishers. In fact, Private American #1, the first issue, the first of 3, appears in comic shops this month, as does the first half of Nexus Scourge. So you can pick up Private American and Nexus Scourge in comic shops. Private American is from Antarctic. Nexus Scourge is from Alien. We've also published Florida Man through American Mythology. But now the Comicsgate Kings are talking about setting up an office to sell the books to regular comic book shops. Okay. But as you know, comic book distribution is in trouble. The shops are in trouble, and there are many reasons for this. And one that's seldom discussed is we have a whole generation of kids here who don't read. They've been raised on video games. And frankly, a good video game is a lot more entertaining than a $5 corporate comic, so I don't blame them. But beyond that, Marvel and DC seem determined to drive their audience away. by publishing stuff nobody wants to read.
It's interesting. Like my kids, my youngest one is 10, and she loves Dogman and all this kind of stuff, you know. And then my 13-year-old, she loves manga, you know. And like there's a generation of kids who just miss Marvel, DC, and American style comics. Really, I don't know what happened, that somebody dropped the ball about 10 years ago. And there was a little generation who were buying as much as anybody else, you know, but they were buying other material, you know, they were just gone. I don't know if they can be brought back or whatever, or if you've broken the chain, you know.
What I always say is if you write a comic with a vital, wildly entertaining, insightful, tragic, and humorous story, you're going to sell it. Mm-hmm. The problem with the genre itself is mostly writing, bad writing. Because for years we were getting great art in Marvel and DC comics, and then you'd buy it for the art and you'd read it, and it would be a big letdown because, frankly, the writing didn't measure up. So the challenge is to make the writing measure up to great art. One of the solutions that's been offered for over 20 years is to set up comic kiosks in movie theater lobbies. Mm. But now the movies are driving their audiences away, and a lot of people don't go to the theaters anymore because they don't want somebody behind them kicking the back of their seat. And because you can buy an 85-inch flat screen TV and enjoy it in your own home.
Do you know, that's a great last question, because I've never thought, who are the writers through your career that you've admired, like the comic book writers? Who are the guys that you feel are just knocking it out the park over the years?
Well,
I mean, from the 70s on, who do you admire?
I thought Roy Thomas Conan adaptations were brilliant, but of course he had Robert E. Howard to go by. I thought that Frank Miller did brilliant work on Daredevil and The Dark Knight Returns. Mm-hmm. Archie Goodwin, when he did Manhunter. Yeah. Chuck Dixon has been consistently good. And now among Comics Hate Kings, I've been impressed with Cyber Frog. I think those are thoughtful, serious stories with great depth. And Aaron Lopresti, who has a real knack for writing.
He's a great artist, Aaron, as well. I like his stuff. Yeah.
But generally, most of the writing, I gotta say, man, that I haven't read a corporate comic in years. I see what they post on the comic book press when they'll take a page and say, look at this. And they're usually doing that to show people how awful the comic is. And I just look at that and I say, well, I have no interest in that. But if there were books I had interest in, I'd buy them. And I do buy the occasional book. And also a lot of people who are putting out books send them to me because they want to hear what I think about them. Yeah. And I'll tell them. And occasionally some are very good. Some are very good.
I found an odd thing, like I buy, those big essentials, those big, thick 500-page black and white Marvel books. DC had their own version of those as well. Every time I see one of those, they cost about $15. And every time I see one, I buy one. And I've got millions of them in the house that I just give out to people to get them into comics.
Yeah,
so the masters, those guys, going from Stan Lee through Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas and those guys, it kind of covers that period of comics. And kids love them now. And my kids had no idea that they were old comics. They were as contemporary to them as Dogman, And there's something beautiful about that, isn't there? That they stood the test of time. These guys really knew what they were doing.
You're a hero.
But I've just been brainwashing my children. I was telling a friend last night that in lockdown especially, the kids were watching what I was watching on TV and they were sort of reading what I was reading. So my two youngest, they get really into Columbo, right? And at the time, I think they were 7 and 9, right? And they got really into Columbo. And then when they went back to school, they were saying none of the kids in the yard want to play at Columbo, And I was like, well, that's maybe no surprise, So like, I don't know what they're going to end up like.
The Detective Columbo?
Yeah. So the kids were obsessed with Columbo. Listen, Mike, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I hope we get to meet in real life, actually, at some point.
Me too. Let me know when you're in the States.
I will do. You know, I'm going to at some point do a tour. I'm going to do a little tour across the whole US. I did it about 15 years ago, and I had the best time. You know what's funny about America is it's all great, right? I mean, I love America. But every state that I go to, they always say, it's great here, but you're going to hate those next guys, you know? But every bit is brilliant. Every bit is very different. It's like a bunch of different countries all put together, you know, but I love it. So I'm going to do a tour, and hopefully I see you on that tour at some point. You know?
I would love that.
Listen, great talking to you, and all the best.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks then. Catch you later.